Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online. News that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Thank you for joining us on this special edition of Newsmakers. I'm Fred Martino. I'm pleased to welcome for the half hour this week Delano Lewis. He was an ambassador to South Africa during the Clinton administration and also held the post as President of NPR. Those are just two positions in a fascinating life. He writes about his experiences in the new book, No Condition is Permanent. Delano, it is great to have you with us on Newsmakers.
Thank you, Fred. It's great to be here.
I should say it's a return. This is your second book
Yes.
about your life. This one is called, as I mentioned, No Condition is Permanent. Tell me about that title, the meaning of that title. You explain it in the book, but I want our viewers to have a chance to understand why you chose that title.
Yes, and a part of that subtitle is a collection of memories. So it is really stories about my life. But when we were in the U.S. Peace Corps in Nigeria and Uganda, the trucks, they call them lorries. The lorries had these wonderful African proverbs on the side of the trucks. Man proposes, but God disposes. That was one. But one that I remembered was no condition is permanent. And it really stuck with me. And I have a jacket at home that my wife Gail did a needlepoint for me on the back of a leather jacket, denim jacket. And it was a lorry with the saying, no condition is permanent. And it's kind of a mantra that if things are great, you know, you realize you're on a high, but things could change. And if you're really low and things are down, realize that it can go up. Yeah. So life is about change.
Yeah, and I like that you mentioned that you see it both ways. It
Yes.
isn't just when you're down, it's also when you're up that
That's
you
right.
realize, well, enjoy every minute.
It's
because
right.
Things
It could
could
change.
It could change. Well, you know, it's hard to pick a number of questions and hard to even think about just a half hour when you think about your life, but we're going to do the best we can.
Right.
And we're going to start when you graduated from law school. You worked for the Justice Department and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, but then your life took a very different turn, and you already mentioned it in your first answer, the Peace Corps. You described this as one of your big risks in life, and you encourage people to take risks, and it was a pivotal decision, as you describe it. Tell me about that decision and what it was like for you. I don't think most people would think an attorney working for the federal government would decide, I'm going to work for the Peace Corps.
Right. It was a very big risk, and it was a turning point in my life. I graduated from law school in '63 and had this great job at the Department of Justice, but I always wanted to do civil rights. And I was in the Internal Security Division of Justice, and we were looking at espionage cases. And I wanted to get into civil rights, and I was able to get to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And I talk about that in the book, and that was in Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of '64 that went into existence in 1965. So I went over there as a lawyer, and I was looking at these cases as they came in. So I was doing a legal job and fulfilling my dream of working in civil rights, dealing with employment discrimination. And then at a dinner party with a justice colleague, there was a woman who was a desk officer for West Africa and asked if I thought about ever going to the Peace Corps. And I said, Peace Corps? I thought this is for younger people with not married, and I had married and 3 children at that time. And so she said you could go as Peace Corps staff. And so it was a big shift. I wanted to be in the law. I wanted to stay within the law. I wanted to work in civil rights. This would put me into administrative work, would put me in a different culture. It would put me away from the U.S. And so it was something to think about. But when I talked to Gail about it, she was very adventuresome. She said, is there a choice? And it would turn out to be one of the best decisions of our life.
And tell me why you say that.
Because it opened up the horizons to us. We were in Nigeria for a year. We got to understand the people of Nigeria. We lived in Benin City. We learned a different culture, different languages. It just opened up horizons. And then I became Peace Corps director at age 28 in Uganda. So we lived in East Africa for 2 years. And again, it gave me a chance to lead. I was head of the Peace Corps, about 160 teaching volunteers. So it was a marvelous experience, and obviously it positioned me later on for many, many opportunities.
Yeah. Well, after this, you also had a chance in politics. You worked for Senator Edward Brooke of Massachusetts, the first African American elected to the Senate since Reconstruction. Tell me about that experience, and you note in the book that while you were a Democrat and Brooke was a Republican, he hired you knowing that you were in a different party, which was a lovely thing to read in our current political environment, right?
Right. There's no question. He didn't even talk about it. I think he knew, but it was never talked about. I was hired as a legislative assistant, and I was in charge of social legislation, looking at education, Social Security, welfare issues, and it was a wonderful time because he was a very, very good legislator. He had been Attorney General of the state of Massachusetts. He was elected, as you mentioned, he was the first African American since Reconstruction in the United States Senate. So he's a wonderful, wonderful mentor and very good to work for. And so when Walter Fauntroy was elected non-voting delegate to the House of Representatives, he was looking for a chief of staff, and he wanted to have people to interview that had experience on Capitol Hill. So there were a few of us, and I interviewed, and when I had my talk with Senator Brooke before my interviews with Fauntroy, he said, that sounds like a good idea. He said, are you a Democrat? And I said, yes. And so we didn't talk about it until I was getting ready to leave. So it didn't matter to him at that point. He wanted me for my experiences and my legal background, et cetera. So that was how that started.
And after starting in government, you moved to private business for over 2 decades as a public affairs executive for the telephone company that served the Washington, D.C. area. Tell me about that decision, moving out of public service into a private entity, and what it takes, in your view, to work in public affairs.
Yes, you know, the book is a collection of memories, but there are some themes that go across the book. Mm-hmm. You mentioned one about taking risk and moving from a safe job in the federal government to a Peace Corps environment in another country. And the other theme is getting outside your comfort zone. Once now I know I could do government work, law and administrative, but I didn't have any sense that I was a business person. And what about this telephone company? And that offer came to me because pre-home rule, before there was home rule on elected mayor and elected city council or anything like that, if you had a business in the district, you had to go to Capitol Hill to go to the House District Committee because they controlled it. It was a federal city. There was no local government. So the telephone company, it was called the Chesapeake and Potomac Telephone Company, was the largest private employer in the region. And the vice president and the assistant vice president for public affairs had an idea, had a vision. They said, well, suppose home rule comes to the district. Suppose there's an elected mayor and an elected city council. There's going to be a regulatory body. And so we don't have to go to the district committee. We'll have to talk about our rate increases to a local regulatory body. So we need to bring someone into the company that has political experience, has a legal background, that can position us if home rule comes to the city. And so Assistant Vice President would come up to Capitol Hill, and his name was Charles Weichel, and he took me to lunch and asked me if I might be interested in coming to work in public affairs at C&P Telephone Company. And that's how that started.
Okay. What would you say was the most difficult thing working in public affairs? 2 decades, it's a long time.
Well, I moved not only in public affairs, they treated me very well in that 21 years. Within 3 years, I became an assistant vice president, so I was in charge of regulatory matters, and I worked with the lawyers on rate cases before the Regulatory Commission. And again, the president and the vice president's vision for the telephone company did come about. There was home rule bill passed, there was an elected mayor and a city council, and there was a regulatory body. So public affairs dealt with the outreach to not only the community that we serve, but to the government entity and the Regulatory Commission. So the toughest job probably was going to the commission and asking for rate relief. In other words, you're increasing the rates for telephone service. That was probably the most difficult one, and then trying to explain that to your customers. So that was probably the toughest
The hardest. And what was the most fun? What did you enjoy the most?
The most fun, I must say, was that they allowed executives, they meaning the management of the company, encouraged executives to get involved in the community. That was part of the old AT&T system, American Telephone and Telegraph. We were one of the subsidiaries of that system, and they encouraged their managers to get involved. So I was involved in not-for-profits groups. I was involved with arts groups. I was involved with community groups and business groups. So that was the fun part of the job, not only learning business, but being involved in the DC community.
That's great. Certainly something many of us here at KRWG value as well, that we have a chance to participate deeply in the community, not just covering the community, but being involved in various community groups. For you, though, this went a step further. When you worked for the telephone company, you actually ran for the DC City Council. You did very well, but didn't quite get elected. You lost the election. You considered running again, but you decided against it when your wife, Gail, said that basically you'd have to do that as a single man.
She was very explicit.
Yes. Tell me about your attraction, though, for politics. This wasn't the beginning, obviously. You had worked for politicians, and then you were running for office. And tell me about that attraction for possibly, at that time, becoming an elected official.
Yes, I think in my life I'd always been attracted to politics. I always, in high school, I was involved with the student council. I was president of student council and vice president of my class in 1955, and I graduated in 56. Went off to University of Kansas and pledged a fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, and I became president of that chapter of the fraternity. So I was always involved in leadership roles and always felt that looking at government, because I was in political science, that politics you could make change. Not only elected politics, but working in the political system, understanding government, you can make change in laws and you can make things happen. So I always had that attraction to politics. So I didn't know I was going to be a candidate, but when that home rule bill was passed and there were elected seats for at-large seats and ward seats, I decided to run for one of the 4 at-large seats, but only 2 could belong to the Democratic Party. They reserved 2 other seats for the Independent Party, Republican, or statehood. So there were 9 of us running in a Democratic primary for 2 seats. Oh, wow. And Marion Barry came in way ahead of the pack. He had great name recognition, and I was back and forth for that second seat with Reverend Douglas Moore, who also had more name recognition than I did. I had a good organization. I'd raised money. I think people were understanding my issues, but I didn't have the name recognition, and I ran a close third in that election. So by a few thousand votes, I lost.
Yeah.
And so 76 rolls around, and half of the council was up. And Marion Barry became a very good friend, and he said, why don't you run again? I'm sure you get elected. We could do things together on the council. Well, Gail had other ideas. She felt that politics really wasn't compatible with family, and she counseled against it, and I believed her, and I didn't run.
Yeah.
And then, lo and behold, I was promoted shortly thereafter in 76 to assistant vice president, then vice president of the company, and then president. So I had a great 21 years during that time. And I was able to use politics. I was able to get involved in politics as well as learning business.
And I like that story because of a couple reasons. One is that a marriage is a partnership. And this is an illustration of that these are joint decisions very often in good marriages.
Right.
But also because had you made a different decision, you may not have had the incredible opportunities that came later. And one of them you knew I would ask you about because we have not only television here, but radio, NPR. You ended up in public service again after decades of working for the telephone company. You were recruited by a search firm and became president of NPR. What an incredible change, never having been in charge of a broadcasting entity, and now you're in charge of a national radio network. Tell me about that decision, making that decision, and what this was like.
Well, you know, one of the things I talk about in the book again is how do you make these decisions? And I wrote the first book. It all begins with self, and that was my first book, and it was kind of a how-to book. And one of the first things in the book I talk about is self-assessment. Get a sense of what your strengths are. Well, I did a self-assessment in the early 90s at the telephone company. And I'd worked my way up to president of a DC operations for Bell Atlantic that later became Verizon. But then as things began to change within the telephone business and in telecommunications, I wasn't sure what my next move was. I wasn't sure that maybe I had plateaued, maybe this was high as I was going to go. I was not an engineer. I thought maybe if the company went internationally, I could go internationally. Well, they went internationally, then they came back and they didn't pursue international as I thought they would. So I had to say to myself, where am I going to go next? And so when that call came from an executive search firm, it was a call at the right time because I was thinking about this. So the call came from the search firm. I went to have lunch with Arnie Miller of Isaacson and Miller, and we talked about NPR. And he said, again, it's another important part of the book. I said, why did you call me? And he said, well, I worked for the President Carter's White House. I was in education and I was involved in living in the city. And I used to see your name in the newspaper, and you were a lawyer and you worked in government and you were in business and communications. And so I remembered that. So another part of that book is you never know who's watching you.
Yeah.
The second part is when the door opens, do you have the skills to take advantage of those opportunities? And so when he said, how about NPR? I learned more about NPR. I was a listener, but I didn't know about the inner workings of National Public Radio. So I said yes. So I put my hat in the ring and ended up finding out later that there was some 200 applicants, and they narrowed it down to 2. And so I was against one other person. I was against several other 100 before, but then it ended up with 2 of us, and I was selected and started being president of National Public Radio in 1994. Fabulous experience. It was
and you were there
smaller,
for about 5 years,
almost
right?
5 years,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It was a very different experience from managing 2,000 and 3,000 people to managing 400 people with 800, 600 stations at that time around the country. So it was a very different management experience.
And such a very different time that we live in now. Even then, NPR had a major focus on journalism, as it does today, although today we have many more programs. What do you make of the environment today in which journalism is under attack by many people, and most notably the President of the United States?
Yes, that's really sort of a travesty because one of the bulwarks of our democracy is an independent free press. And so that's a very, very important piece of our system. It lends some checks and balances to government. So a free press is very, very important. So I would encourage people to always look for an independent press. And NPR is really the epitome of that. You get in-depth news, you get balanced coverage, you get international news. I used to have my cab driver test when I lived in Washington, and when I get in the car, they were usually NPR in the car, and I'd say, why do you listen to NPR? And the driver would say, that's the best for international news, because the driver was probably from another country. But so it's balanced news, it's in-depth, it's very good news. But we have lots of other opportunities for news these days. In those early years, you had very few sources. Now you have a number of sources for communication, and you get instant communication. But a free press is extremely, extremely important.
In addition to concerns that many people have about the attacks on the press, there are also many people who are worried about our political climate in the age of the Trump administration. What are your thoughts on this? I know that's a broad question, but.
Yes, and I know this is not a political show, and I'm not here to talk politics, but I think what I really would like to stress is there's more we have in common than we have apart in this country. And one of the travesties in both parties sometimes, but certainly more present, it appears, in the Trump administration, you really push with politics of fear. And where people have these concerns and they have these legitimate fears, and you push out politics and exploit those fears when people are concerned about immigration, and maybe rightly so, that they've got a job and the job may be handling it in the balance, and someone is saying, if you let these borders open, you may lose your job. Well, there may be competition for those jobs, but that's no reason to be that strong in keeping people out, because this is a country of immigrants. It was founded by immigrants. And so I think that there's more to politics than being divisive. We have a lot more in common, and so we should be talking about that more than those things that divide us.
Yeah. very quickly, in addition to divisiveness, how much do you think the unpredictable nature of this administration plays into a lot of different issues? We just, every day it seems like a new crisis.
Well, I think part of that is, we've had crises in our government system for many, many years. Mm-hmm. And we've had differences of opinion for many, many years. But I think what the difference is today is it's instant. Mm-hmm. We have instant communications. You pick up your smartphone, there's an alert. Our president uses tweets. And so there's this constant instant communication. So when you say it's unpredictable, so I think the unpredictability now has become predictable, that there's going to be constant change. So what that means is, as a US citizen, you've got to be a lot more vigilant. You've got to make sure you go and understand the issues. You've got to look for candidates that will represent you and the way you believe. And then you've got to go out and organize and bring those people to the polls to make things happen the way you think they should happen.
Good way to put it.
So it's a part of our democracy.
We have a lot more sources of information, but also, I think you're hitting it right on the mark. We also have more responsibility.
Absolutely.
Because of the changes that are happening so quickly. Well, you were recruited, of course, as I mentioned at the beginning of the program, by the Clinton administration to serve as ambassador to South Africa. You call this in the book the honor of your life. Tell me what this was like, and about, of course, meeting the late Nelson Mandela.
Yes, it was the very exciting part of my life, and you might say the pinnacle of my career, because mm-hmm. to be a U.S. ambassador is a high honor to whatever country that you're nominated to serve. Mm-hmm. But for me, to be not only the U.S. ambassador, but to be the U.S. ambassador to the Republic of South Africa, because here was a country in transition. Minority rule was dismantled. President Mandela, Nelson Mandela, who'd spent 27 years in prison, came out of prison and ran for that first democratic elective office in 1994.
And we should give people an historical concept here. When you say minority rule, it was about 20% white, but they ran everything.
Absolutely.
The white population.
And it was very, very analogous to our segregation and Jim Crow in mm-hmm. the U.S., where the minority white population was dominating a majority black population. And that was called apartheid. And so that system was very, very, very cruel in many ways. You couldn't move freely, you couldn't vote, you couldn't represent, you have no representation or very little representation in the government. They had passbook laws, so you had to carry a passbook around and be stamped if you're going to move from one place to the other. So there were segregated facilities, very much like we had in the US. So that was a minority-controlled government based on race, and that was overturned. But then you have to give some credit to President de Klerk, who decided, along with others in the National Party, that time was going to change, and they began having discussions with Nelson Mandela inside prison. And so it's a remarkable story. He talks about it in his book, Long Walk to Freedom, where they began to talk to him about releasing him and about what might happen if they began to work on some kind of partnership in this government with whites and blacks and people of color. And so they began to set this up, and they released him. And in the book, there was an interesting piece. They were ready to move out and to let him go and to be released from prison. And he says, I'm not ready yet. And they said, you're not ready yet. He says, no, I have lots of other pieces I have put together. I have a lot of other people I've got to contact. We've got to make the system work. So when I walk out of here, it'll begin to flow. He spent 27 years and he said he wasn't ready yet. Mm-hmm. So he had other things to do. And then when he did walk out, it was a marvelous kind of euphoria, because he decided that we were all, as he said, we're all one South Africans. Mm-hmm. He said, we're not going to treat the minority whites as they treated us. We're all one South Africa. Yeah. And that was that attitude that made the difference in South Africa.
And we're quickly running out of time, so tell me about meeting Nelson Mandela. All of the accounts, it seems, that when people get a chance, have had a chance in the past when he was alive to meet him, say that it was a remarkable experience.
Yes, and that was true for me too. I met him on several occasions. I presented my credentials to Thabo Mbeki, who was the president who succeeded Nelson Mandela. And then I did a call on Nelson Mandela shortly after I arrived as well. And he's a giant of a man. He was tall, but he was so stately. And when you were in his presence, you felt his humility, you felt his stature. The thing that I remember most about him was when he talked politics, he talked inclusiveness. He talked about, he said he was working on the issues in Burundi, the country of Burundi. And he said they had 16 political parties. And he said, my job is to help them work through, to bring all those parties to the table. And that's the way he ran South Africa. That's what he talked about in South Africa. Being inclusive, bringing everyone to the table. And I think that's a lot we could learn here. They also talked about reconciliation. Truth and Reconciliation Commission started with Archbishop Desmond Tutu shortly after Mandela was elected, where they would bring out in the open how apartheid really impacted people. So we could talk about it and put it out there, and we could also forgive. So there were some very real principles that he believed in and real principles that he enunciated once he became president, and his legacy is still alive today.
Certainly is. Well, we're almost out of time, and this is a wonderful way for us to end our conversation. One of the things I highlighted in the book when I read the book was you say in the book that early on in life, you felt that you had a gift to lead. What told you that?
Well, I think my family, and particularly my mother. I was an only child, and my father was a railroader, only had 11th grade education. My mother was a domestic, she was a high school graduate, but she had such a wealth of breadth of knowledge, and I spent a lot of time as an only child with her, and my family gave me everything they could, and a solid education was one of the things they talked about. But she encouraged me to get involved with the community. She encouraged me to get involved with music, so I played violin and trumpet. I was drum major of the band. So I got that encouragement from my mom and my support from my dad, that I did have this ability to communicate with people. I had this ability to reach out and for people to listen. And so I just carried that on in life. And one position led to another, and I treated people as I wanted to be treated. That was one of the things that I believed in. So I think it all started at home.
Okay. Well, it's a wonderful book, and I enjoyed reading it very, very much. And I'm sure many of the folks who are watching here right now will love reading it as well. Delano, it is always a pleasure to see you. Thank you for sharing a second time for a second book, a little bit about your life and the amazing experiences that you've had.
Thank you very much, Fred. And you can get that book. You can order it for ordernewbook.com or go to my website, ambassadordelanolewis.com. And thank you for allowing me to share it. And I hope others will enjoy it and be inspired by the book.
Thank you. Thank you again. Thank you for joining us at home. Join us this week on KRWG Radio every weekday. It's Morning Edition from 5 until 9. Fresh Air at 11, followed by Here and Now, noon to 2, and All Things Considered, 4 to 7. KRWG News is always online at krwg.org. We'd love to hear from you. Email us with your story ideas and video submissions. The address is feedback@nmsu.edu. For all of us at KRWG News, I'm Fred Martino. Have a great week. We'll see you next time on Newsmakers.